Hey buddy, this is Charles Side by Side Garage. On today's episode, I'm going to show you how to install a Hypercoil dual rate spring kit on this 19 Polaris RZR Turbo S 4-seater. Stay tuned. There's usually two main reasons that guys upgrade their suspension on their side-by-side. It's either to increase the ride height or increase the ride quality. The easiest and cheapest method to actually gain back some ride height is just to increase the preload on your spring. That's actually going to decrease your ride quality though, so it's usually a little counterproductive, but like I said, it's cheap. The second option you have out there, if your springs actually have a tender spring, is that you can swap out the weak tender spring with a stiffer one. This is going to give you a little more ride height, and in most cases, it also increases the ride quality some. The third option you have is to actually do a full spring kit. In this case, we're converting to a true dual rate system. This is going to give you both better ride height as well as it's going to increase your ride quality. This is going to be the best that you can do until you actually open up your shock and change the valving, which leads us to the fourth option. Take the shock off, you send it in, have custom valving done, as well as custom springs to go along with your ride and your riding style. Because my RZR is actually pretty new and it has low mileage and it's got those Dynamix live valving shocks, I didn't want to go with option 4. I didn't want to do a full shock rebuild and spend all that money on it. I decided to go with just a true dual rate spring kit. I actually chose Hypercoil because in the automotive industry and the racing field, Hypercoil is well known for their quality. Their springs and their kits are made in the USA. I use these Hypercoil kits on my race car actually for autocrossing. So I know that they work and I know that they work well. I know that they actually do what they're advertised to do and the guys know what they're talking about. All right, what we have here is the actual true dual rate spring kit on this shock already. Now your stock RZR shock, technically it's a dual spring kit, but you don't actually typically get to utilize that upper spring and the load that it can take because that tender spring that's on your stock shock is usually a very weak spring. As you see, they're normally all the way fully collapsed, just sitting at ride height. Now a lot of guys will throw those aftermarket tenders on there and it'll be a stiffer spring, but it's still not a true dual rate system because the only way that you can actually start utilizing both of those springs and then transfer that load down onto the bottom spring is if that tender spring gets into coil bind. Usually whenever you get coil bind on those aftermarket tender springs, a lot of times they'll break. I know I've broken a few of them myself. So what you utilize to get the true dual rate spring kit is called a crossover ring right here. Now what that does is your top spring and your bottom spring soaks up load, so this crossover or your spring divider right here will actually ride up your shock body as that shock compresses until it comes into contact with that crossover ring right there. So for example, let's say this is a 300-pound spring and this is a 300-pound spring. There's actually a formula that you can use to calculate how much load it takes to compress each of these springs 1 inch, and then you can also figure out after so much travel how much load is required before you stop dividing the load between both springs and the load is only taken on by one spring. The formula is going to be your top spring times your bottom spring divided by your top spring plus your bottom spring. So with this example right here of 300 pounds and 300 pounds, it actually ends up only requiring 150 pounds of force or load on there to compress this entire thing 1 inch because it's divided by both of them. I have this crossover ring right here set up about 1.25 inches up above this spring divider. So that first inch, it only takes that 150 pounds to compress these. Now, like I said, this is about 1.25 inches, so then it's going to require a little more load past that before it actually comes into contact. But once this spring divider does come into contact with that crossover ring, it now goes up to just this spring taking on that load. Now, remember, let's say that was a 300-pound spring. The first inch was just 150. Let's say now we've hit that crossover ring. Now every inch is an additional 300 pounds to compress. what that allows you to do is all that small chatter, you know, your dirt road driving and stuff like that, you're just cruising or whatever, that load's getting taken up by both springs, and it makes a nice plush ride. But whenever you start hitting like those water bars or those whoops, stuff like that, those really big hits, that first little bit is soft, and then it really stiffens up onto that bottom spring right there. It makes the ride much more enjoyable. It's way easier on your back and the ride quality and everything like that. And it also prevents you from bottoming out all the way down here onto your bump stop of your shock. So I actually went through one of Hypercoil's dealers. I got this kit from Josh Cock of 704 Off-Road. He was pretty helpful whenever I was messaging him back and forth. I had some questions and stuff, and he made sure and answered those. So I appreciate that. Now, whenever you're looking at doing a spring kit on your side-by-side, it's a really good thing if you actually measure it beforehand. A lot of people think that these side-by-sides only weigh about 1,500 or 2,000 pounds, whatever that service manual says. And in reality, it doesn't weigh anywhere near that. Usually those weights in the service manual are dry weights, which means no fluids in them. And as soon as you start throwing on roll cages, heavy duty suspension, big tires, all your accessories, your sound system, stuff like that, that weight actually starts to add up pretty quick. So before I actually ordered this up, I wanted to get a corner weight of the RZR so that I could give those weights to Josh, and he could then relay that information to Hypercoil so that the springs that I would get with my kit were actually set up for my RZR and the style of riding that I do. So I weighed this thing. Normally this weighs, I think, 1959 dry weight in the service manual. On the scales, it actually weighs 2,652 pounds. So like I said, it's a considerable difference, and that's something that you should take into account whenever you're going to do a spring kit. Whenever you order up a Hypercoil dual rate spring kit for the RZR, it's actually going to come with your 2 upper and lower springs for the front, your 2 upper and lower springs for the rear shocks, as well as these 8 spring adapters for the rear, and then your crossover rings. You've got 2 front and 2 rear. Next thing we're going to do is actually lift up the RZR, take the tires and wheels off, and then we'll show you how to take the shocks off there and install this kit. Since you're going to be removing this shock, you want to make sure you have either a strap or a jack stand, something to hold up this suspension. That way you don't risk damaging your CV axle. In order to get this shock off there, all you have to do is take this bolt out, so you just need a socket and the wrench. In the case of the Turbo S, both of these bolts are 18 millimeters. A lot of the other machines, your 1Ks, your regular turbos, they're usually a 15 millimeter. On this Fox shock, the live valve, it had this plug in there. I've already pulled it out, so you need to make sure and do that. Don't just go yanking that shock out of there once you get your bolts out. I know a lot of you guys are probably going to ask where I got these shock covers from. These are from sealsavers.com. It just makes sure that it protects your shaft in there, so make sure and check those guys out. You can see we got one of the front shocks off of the machine. In order to compress these springs down, you're going to need some sort of spring compressor. This right here is the one I used to use. These are pretty common. Basically, these had these little hooks, and you would put these on both sides of the spring. You'd use the impact, you'd alternate torquing these down, and you'd compress that spring. I was doing enough tuning on my own shocks and stuff like that that I ended up building this spring compressor right here. You can also buy some that are real similar to this setup, just because spring compressors can be pretty dangerous. You always want to wear iPro with them, and you want to be real careful, real conscientious of what you're doing, because you can definitely hurt yourself very badly if you don't respect what you're doing there. This right here is just a flat blade screwdriver. The reason I have this is because there's these 2 rubber bump stops on the shock shaft down here at the end, and what you're going to need to do is actually slide both of them up towards the shock body. That way you can get this end collar off of there. You're also going to need some sort of measuring device, just a simple tape measure. This is so you can measure things like the preload at the end of the shock right here. And that leads me into, real fast, we'll go over a few parts of this shock. This right here is just your main spring. This small spring right here is the tender spring. and then your preload is measured up here. Usually it's measured from the start of either your mainspring, if that's all you have, or if you have a tender setup like this, it's measured from the end over to where the shock body goes up into the body or the cap. Now there's actually a measurement out there in the service manual. Polaris says the front shock, you can set it at 2.88 inches of preload, and then you can add up to an extra inch of preload. So from right here over to the start of the spring, you could set it at that 2 7/8, and then if you add weight to your machine and stuff, you could increase that measurement by an inch. By moving this collar down, that's going to put more spring tension on there, which is going to actually raise your machine up in the air a little bit so you gain back some of that ground clearance. Before I actually start compressing this shock down, I was going to mention that you don't actually have to use a spring compressor whenever you do your rear shocks, just because this shock body where it's threaded is so long that you can actually back off this spring adjustment ring or this spanner nut right here so that you can actually take your shock apart and get your springs off there without compressing this down. The front shocks, because of how tall these springs are, even if you were to back this all the way off, there's still tension right here, so you can't actually get the thing apart. The factory actually gives you this spanner wrench right here so that you can make adjustments to this nut. That's what this little tool is for. That end, remember, was so that you can actually take the pressure off the secondary clutch. Talk about that in a different video. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is actually take that screwdriver and pry over those little rubber bump stops right there. Whenever you're pushing these over, if you're going to use any sort of tool like this, just make sure that you don't damage that shaft right there. I just used a quick shot of Windex on there and it helped lube up the shaft so that you can actually get those bumpers to go over a little bit easier. All right, the next thing we're going to actually do is turn this right here, and that's going to compress the spring down because we've got to move it over far enough that we can get this spring mount off of the shock. Now we've got the spring compressed, there's plenty of room so we can get that mount out of there. And then we're going to back this off so we can relieve all that pressure off the spring. Now you've got all the tension off, you can just pull both your primary spring and your tender off of there. Next thing I'm going to do is actually set up the initial preload on here. The numbers that I got from Josh Koch was to start off with 3.25 inches of preload on these front shocks. So what I'm going to do is measure from right here where the start of the spring is over to the cap and set that at 3.25. And then I'll end up actually getting the machine down on the ground, drive it around a little bit and see if it's the right height that I want. If I need it to be a little bit taller, then I can just adjust this down just like you do the stock spring setup. Now, whenever you're doing these adjustments to this spanner nut right here, it's pretty good practice to make sure that your shock body is nice and clean. You don't want these threads full of crap because then you can mess up your shock whenever you're actually trying to turn this, and it'll help you turn that a lot easier if that shock is clean. Now that we're ready for the new spring setup, you can take that collar and get it up there on the shock body. What I'm going to do is actually thread it the vast majority of the way on there, and then we'll end up adjusting it later. Got that up on there. Next thing we can do is grab our smaller of the two springs and slide it up on the shock. You can take your factory spring divider there, put it up on. Then you can grab your larger spring. I'm just orientating these so that whenever I look at the shock, I can actually read the part numbers on them in case I need to reference that later on. Now, whenever you set these up, there's two arrows on the spring divider. And what I usually do is set so that the end of one spring is lined up with one arrow, and then the end of the other spring is lined up 180 degrees out. Just like that. Now you can go back with the spring compressor and actually compress this all the way down so we can put the spring mount back on there. Now that I've got enough spring pressure on here so that the springs are compressed enough, I can actually get this spring mount back onto the shock shaft. Now I'm gonna hold this here, and then I'm gonna actually adjust the shock around so I can center it up in the spring. So it's a good idea to have a buddy with you at this point. Tony's gonna go ahead and start backing off the pressure off of these springs. Before you actually get too much spring tension on here, what you need to do is actually make sure that where the end of this bottom spring is 180 degrees out from where this gap in your spring mount is. Now that's according to the Polaris service manual. So right there, the spring end is at the bottom, and that opening is right at the top. You can also double check up here on your divider and make sure that the end of your bottom spring is also 180 degrees out from the end of your top spring. This one's still good to go, so we can go ahead and let the rest of that pressure off. You don't need to move these little rubber bumpers or bump stops back down to the bottom. As soon as you take your first good hit on the shock, it'll just push them right back down there. All right, next up, we got to knock out these rear shocks. So it's basically the same process as the front. You support your suspension up so that you're not going to damage your axles, your CVs or anything. You got to unplug on these live shocks. Make sure you unplug the clips up top here. There's also a zip tie that I forgot to mention over here that actually holds this harness to the shock. You need to make sure you clip that before you just try yanking that shock out of there. Same thing right here. You've got 18 millimeter bolts, top and bottom. So just take those off, and then we'll get the spring kit put on here. All right, next up, we've got the rear shock off the machine. We got it set up in the spring compressor. Like I mentioned earlier, with this rear RZR shock, it's actually long enough that you wouldn't need to use a spring compressor on this one. If you really wanted to just back off the spanner nut all the way, you'd be able to get the springs out. The spring compressor is just going to make it easier and faster to do. It all depends on your shock length and your application, whether or not you need a spring compressor to actually swap out the springs. The process on this rear shock is almost the exact same as the front, with the exception that you have to put on 4 of these little spring adapters per shock. And the reason why is because these stock coil springs are a slightly smaller diameter than these new Hypercoil springs. So this little adapter, whenever you put these on each end of the spring, is just going to take up that little bit of slack so you don't have play within your springs. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually get this shock and this spring compressed right here. That way I can take off the spring mount down here at the bottom. Again, I'm going to have to move this little rubber bump stop here. This is just one solid one instead of being 2. And because the spring mount is actually smaller as far as the height, I'm not going to have to compress this quite as far to get this thing off there. After that, I can go ahead and get this shock body cleaned up once the springs are off of there. And then I'll go ahead and start getting the new springs installed. All right, I just got all the stock springs and stuff off here. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually take the very first spring adapter and get it slid up onto the shock body here. Now, I also already set the preload on here where it was that I was going to start off with. So that's ready to go. Next, I can take the spring crossover nut and actually get it all the way up on the shock body there. I'm not really worried about where this is right now because I'm going to end up moving it, but that way it's in position. Next, I can take my upper spring and slide it onto the shock. After that, you need to take your collar Make sure you put spring adapter on there. Slide another spring adapter on the other side. Then I can put my main spring on. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and start getting the ends of the springs lined up with the arrows on this collar right here. Remember, I'm placing the ends of these springs so that they're 180 degrees, the end of this spring in relation to the bottom spring. The next thing I'm going to actually do is get this main spring, or the bottom spring, compressed up here enough that I can slide on this last spring adapter. And you actually have to get it on there first. You can't actually stack it on here and then try to put it on there for the obvious reason. Now I've got these springs compressed far enough, I can actually slide in that last spring adapter. Then I can take that spring mount, place it in there. Remember, you're going to want to orientate the opening of that spring mount so it's 180 degrees away from the end of that spring. Before we release all the tension off here, we can double check the ends up here to make sure that they're still 180 degrees out. At this point, we can go ahead and back this pressure off. All right, I went ahead and got this shock put back on the machine. I also took the other shock off, repeated the whole process on that side, so I've got the spring kit fully on there now. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and throw the tires and wheels on here so I get this thing down on the ground out of the shop and see what sort of difference the ride height is now. Something to remember whenever you're putting these Dynamix shocks back on there, make sure you put the plugs back in and throw your new zip tie back over there to keep that wire in place. Yeah, see how she does. As you can see, we got the RZR out of the shop. Right now it looks like I've got right about 1.5 inches of ground clearance over where I was with the stock spring setup. I still need to fine tune the front preload just a little bit. Those crossover rings, I gotta adjust those just a little bit as well. If you're not following us on Instagram and Facebook, make sure that you do, because I will make sure and throw a review of the new springs once I've actually got some miles on them. And I'll also be more than willing to share the adjustments that I've made so that you guys don't have to spend the time doing that if you decide to go with this setup. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share. Catch you next time.